Hi everyone. On June 9th, the Holy Orthodox Church celebrates the memory of a truly marvelous saint, a Russian named Cyril of White Lake. Now, Saint Cyril was someone who was privileged in his youth, born into an aristocratic family, but yet he was also orphaned at a fairly early age, and so one of the friends of the family, Timothy the boyar, who was active in the court of Prince Dmitry Donskoy at the time, took over his life and education. However, Cyril, being very pious, even from a very early age, and loving the things of the church, was someone that desired something greater than simply growing up in an aristocratic family and most probably fulfilling the duties of someone who would be expected to assume roles at the court. Cyril was bored with things at the court, and so he sought out an elder named Stephen, who took him under his wing and in fact tonsured him, and then was a little bit afraid of bringing him back to Timothy to tell him what had happened. So Stephen said, "Well, don't worry, I will bring you now to Timothy, and I will speak to him first." Now, Cyril's name before his tonsure was Cosmas. And so he went to Timothy, and he said, "I have taken Cosmas from you, but I bring back to you Cyril the monk." Well, Timothy was not happy with this at all, and in fact was rather rude to the holy elder. But later on, after the elder had left, he and his wife had a discussion, and they realized that he had made a mistake. And so he called Timothy back and said, "Well, as it is God's will and your blessing, then I will approve of Cyril becoming a monk." And that he did, in the very famous Simonov Monastery in Moscow, one of the largest and most important there at the time. And Cyril eagerly entered into many duties in the monastery and was assigned finally to the bakery. He was there for about 9 years and then was taken out, and yet regretted it because he felt that he had more spiritual peace when he was there, because he would be in the bakery and he would see the burning flames and he would think, "Cyril, you need to watch yourself lest you end up in those burning flames." And so he became noted in the monastery for someone who was eager to help in any way that he could, a really truly devoted monk, and in fact so devoted that he began to act like a fool for Christ. This actually got him in trouble with the abbot Theodore, who was at first not understanding what was going on and thinking Cyril was being simply disobedient, but later he began to understand that Cyril indeed had at least a partial calling to this way of life and was more accommodating toward him. In the meanwhile, Cyril's reputation among the monks continued to grow, and at one point, Abbot Theodore became the Bishop of Rostov. And so when that happened, the brethren overwhelmingly elected Cyril to take his place. This would have been when Cyril was somewhere between 30 and 50 years of age. We're not exactly sure, because he basically became tonsured at around the age of 30. And so Cyril took over the monastery, and he was very, very loving towards everyone, yet also very strict, but he kept feeling a need for a greater solitude in his life, a greater devotion to Christ without all the hubbub around him. And so at one point he actually retired to his cell and left the abbacy. But even then, it didn't seem to stop anyone from seeking him out and coming to him and asking him for all sorts of advice. He spent as many years as he could in this sort of semi-secluded state, but yet it was never one of total isolation. And yet finally, when he was praying one night before the icon of the Hodegetria, Mother of God, when he did the akathist to her, and he got to the 8th stanza, and he heard a voice saying to him, "Come to Belozersk. There I have a place for you." Now, Belozersk means White Lake, And it was a place north of Moscow, very, very isolated, especially in the 1300s, where the northern Tibet existed and has often been referred to as the forest desert of the north in Russia. St. Cyril ended up leaving the monastery and seeking out the place at White Lake. And there was another monk that was with him who eventually left and went on and founded yet another monastery. But then after a while, two other former monks in the monastery that Cyril was in came and joined him. And he dug a big hole and made a hut and started the beginnings of what would become eventually the monastery of St. Cyril at White Lake. Cyril was someone who was, again, very strict in his monastic existence. He permitted absolutely no talking during services. No one could leave early from the services. At the times of the trapeza, when the monks would have their meal, there was a reading done, but again, no talking, and was very, very strict in this regard. But he also developed the gift of foresight, the gift of healing, and the gift of working miracles. At one point, they came to him and said that there's no wine for the Eucharist. The liturgy was just hours away, and they were surprised. And St. Cyril said, well, go bring me the bottles that the wine has been in. And the monks went back and they opened them up, and they were full and brimming and did not run out for weeks and weeks after that. The same happened once with some bread that he was distributing to the poor. They said, we have no more, but yet he said, go get the baskets and give it to them. And there was more that was needed for all of the people that needed bread in the area. St. Cyril was also someone who was responsible for a number of healings, and in fact, one person even rose from the dead after his prayers. They came to him and wanted to bring the Eucharist to this man, and by the time they got to St. Cyril, well, the man had already reposed. And they came back and told him, and he said, well, let's get the Eucharist and go see him anyway. And when they came back to the bed, the man, to their astonishment, was sitting up, and he received the Holy Eucharist, and hours after that, he laid back down and gave up his soul to God. St. Cyril was in this monastery in White Lake from the age of 60 to the age of 90 until his final repose after the celebration of Pentecost, his last liturgy, in the year 1427. After he died, of course, his reputation continued to grow, and the monastery just exploded in numbers. It is, even today, one of the most fascinating looking places you could see. And I would encourage everyone out there listening to this to Google Cyril of White Lake Monastery and see some of the extraordinary photos that came up. The place is huge. It's got 11 churches in it, some extraordinary icons. It used to have a library of over 2,000 books, but these were eventually moved to Moscow and to St. Petersburg. But among the treasures of the library were 16 books written by St. Cyril, along with 3 letters to different princes that he wrote to, part of the great legacy that he left behind. Even today, there are active monks that are there that were put back in 1998 after the Soviets closed, as they did so many important places, the monastery in 1924. But you can see how phenomenal a place it is. St. Cyril, of course, was a spiritual child of the great St. Sergius of Radonezh, who, when he was a young monk, used to come and visit St. Cyril. St. Sergius, of course, was well known at that time, but every time he came to the Simonov Monastery in Moscow, he would first go to visit Cyril and talk to him about spiritual things. Well, St. Cyril continued his legacy, and this monastery that he established is part of the fruits of that legacy, something that, even though it's not as active as it was once before, is a bedrock foundational representation of the life of St. Sergius continuing through St. Cyril. And even today, despite all of the problems that are there now, even today, there is no doubt that there are many monks there still benefiting from the instruction and spiritual legacy of St. Cyril of White Lake. Bye-bye.